Welcome.
Cheers.
William Dalrymple, such an honor.
Honor for me, sir. Thank you.
Now this is a cold infusion of Ceylon silver tips. Floral, little bit of bubbles, little sparkling,
Very unexpected.
non-alcoholic.
It's
non-alcoholic.
Non-alcoholic. That's very disappointing. I thought.
But that's the point. No,
I might get that gin and tonic after all.
I've just discovered the most extraordinary thing about you, that you trace your history back to Dilmah. Please tell us a little bit more about that.
So, I am descended from 5 very beautiful, talented sisters called the Patel sisters. And the eldest was the least beautiful, but the most talented, who was Julie Margaret Cameron, who was the great Victorian photographer, whose husband and 2 of whose sons were early tea planters in Sri Lanka, and who set up the Dilmah estate near Nurelia. And she's buried in Bhagawan Tala.
Bhagawan Talaba.
Bhagawan
Talaba.
Tarawa. Bhagawan Tawala. And her sister, youngest sister, was my great-grandmother, Sophia, and she was this great beauty who was painted by Watts and Burne-Jones and Rossetti, and lived in this sort of artistic community set up by a 3rd sister, Sarah Prinsep. And where that sister's interesting is she was married, she was one of the Princeps, and James Prinsep was the man who discovered, translated Brahmi and Kharoshti, and discovered that about Ashoka, who had been forgotten from history until they started being able to read the Ashoka inscriptions, and who discovered the origins of the Buddha, which had been forgotten in India for centuries. The whole story, after Buddhism died out in India, everyone had forgotten the Buddhist origins of lying in Lumbini and Bodh Gaya and all these ancient Buddhist sites in North India, Sarnath and so on. And it's incredible to think now, but all the central stories of Buddhism, which survived and flourished in Sri Lanka but died out in India, all this had been forgotten to history in India as the Hinduism rolled over the top of the Buddhist era. And the Princeps were the ones who brought it back. So I'm descended from all these old, crusty colonials who in different ways, I think, had rather remarkable legacies, setting up the tea industry here.
The Cameron family, indeed, absolutely. And in fact, one of our suites at the Ceylon Tea Trails named after Julie Margaret
I'm looking forward to staying in it one day.
You please be our guest. We would love to have you over. Now, one of your books that fascinates me most is The Anarchy. And the reason for that is that while we rely on the tea industry, we also understand the importance of valuing what we have and using it to the benefit of our nation. So colonialism and the mindset that it has perpetuated to a large extent is still hangs over us. To what extent do you think it still persists in the minds of people?
Well, there's 2 subjects in anarchy. One is colonialism in the wider sense, the degree to which colonialism was ultimately, of course, about extraction and about enriching the colonizer at the expense of the colonized, as any colony, any time in history, always is. However benign the colonizers like to feel that they are being, they're there, obviously, to get at the raw materials, the resources of the place that is colonized. And the British have been very good at rewriting history in such a way that they are absolved of all guilt, and a very positive spin has always been put on British colonialism, as opposed, for example, to Belgian colonialism in the Congo or something. But ultimately, it's the same thing. One may be slightly harder edged than the other, or there's different levels of cruelty and oppression, but ultimately it's about extraction. So that's one side of the book. The other side of the book, though, is about the power of enormous corporations, of which the East India Company was the first. East India Company, founded in Shakespeare's London in 1599, the same year and very close to where Shakespeare was writing Hamlet and Julius Caesar in 1599. The East India Company is founded. And it is a terrific success. It basically monopolizes the export of Indian textiles, which then are producing about 40% of the world's GDP. Today, we think of Europe as a very rich area and tend to think of South Asia as a less rich area. But traditionally, the reverse is true. Through most of history, India has been producing by which I mean South Asia has been producing between 30 and 40% of the world's GDP, which is roughly the same proportion that China has produced, leaving very small amounts for the rest of the world. And the East India Company was the principal organ by which that was reversed, so that by 1947, it's more like 7% India and 40% England. And the East India Company and then the Raj were very effective means by which to extract the wealth of this very, very rich part of the world. And Sri Lanka and India both were conquered by the East India Company, not the British Empire. And today, because the East India Company is abolished and both ended up under the Crown, we tend to forget that the agent by which both India and Sri Lanka were colonized was a for-profit corporation that existed entirely to make profits for the shareholders. And what happened to Sri Lanka with the First and Second Kandy Wars in the 1790s and ultimately annexed in, 1815, is what was happening in India between the Battle of Plassey, 1757, and the final sort of conquests of 1857 at the Indian Uprising. And both areas become subject to this for-profit corporation based in a single office block in London. And like any business, it has a share price and a board of directors, and annual general meetings, decides dividends, all the stuff that we're used to in business today that we tend to think is our modern inventions. This is what the East India Company was. So behind the battles and the epaulets and the processions and the elephants and all this farrago of colonialism is, if you like, the beating heart of it is the share price, like a pulse, which is going through the history of colonialism. And it goes up when there's a victory and down when there's a defeat. And there's one moment when the company very nearly goes bankrupt in 1740, when there's a massive famine in Bengal. And that's the point at which, for the first time, the British Crown comes in, because it has to bail out the East India Company, because by this stage, the East India Company is the largest employer in Britain, with people making ships and sails and processing the silk and the opium and the textiles and all the ancillary jobs that go. It's not only a massive force in South Asia, but it's the biggest employer in Britain. So for that reason, unlike Lehman Brothers at the American crash, it is too big to fail. And the government in 1740, when the company has this massive dip, buys the 50% share. And that's the moment that the state begins to get involved in colonialism in South Asia.
We secured independence, probably on the tails of India in 1948, political independence. And yet, the economic form of colonialism that colonization and the East India Company represented persists. To what extent do you think that modern-day corporations are heirs to the East India Company?
Well, the really big corporations are the descendants of the East India Company, but it's a slightly different game. And what we're talking about today is corporations like Apple, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. And these corporations have annual turnovers which are greater than many nation states. And therefore they have the power to break, to bribe, to avoid, to pressurize nation states. So the way, for example, which Amazon has managed to avoid paying tax for many years by moving its postal addresses around from Ireland to other places, Bahamas, St. Kitts, tax havens here, there, and everywhere, is very similar to the way that the East India Company was able to manipulate. And what you often forget when you're looking at the history of the East India Company is it's a two-edged sword. It's not only is it militarily taking on the Marathas or the Mughals or Tipu Sultan and defeating and occupying and seizing and colonizing, but it's also having an effect back in London, where not only does it by rotten boroughs in Parliament. So returning East India Company men end up as MPs in their 40s. They go out at age 16. They come back with a fortune at age 40. They buy an estate and a rotten borough and end up in Parliament. And rather like, you know, some of the powerful American lobbies today in the Senate, or whoever's in power, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, the Rifle Association or the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, have ways of influencing the parties in power. The East India Company is like that, whether it was Whig or Tory in power. They have their men and they have their block vote on certain issues. Then you find that beyond that, 20 or 25% of MPs who are from East India Company backgrounds, 80% have shares in the East India Company. So the influence of the company on the legislature is enormous. And one can think of other examples in South Asia. I mean, most obviously in India, Adani, which has this same sort of relationship whereby on one hand, it's providing campaign funds to the party that it supports, and in return, the party gives it commercial opportunities, yes. And not all of which are completely open to scrutiny and have to be deduced by clever economic deduction. So the East India Company was the original corporation. It was the precursor to all the multinational corporations in the world, but it's also the company that develops and refines the subtle art of political manipulation through campaign funds and lobbying. All of which goes on, obviously, behind every democracy. And in all sorts of aspects, it's not illegal. But that alchemy that when you donate to a political party, you do expect some sort of pro quid quo in policy. And that goes on to the present day. And that, you can say, I think, is a legacy of the East India Company.
Now, I'm going to close with a question on tea, but before I do, I read a very interesting piece, your commentary on Brexit, which I completely share your view. Can I ask you for a comment on that?
Well, it's, I think, one of the great tragedies of not just Britain, but European history, that we've ended up with a bunch of very insular right-wing Tories who persuaded themselves against all the evidence that Brexit would provide enormous economic opportunities for Britain. It clearly hasn't. All the things that were promised, nothing has materialized. There's no massive dividend. And now we're slightly stuck with something that clearly doesn't work, which is a major problem, and which is going to take a generation to unravel, I think. I think the British finally, wherever it is now, 7, 8 years after the vote, have recognized that it's been a mistake. And as we sit in the queue with the Afghans waiting for admittance to European companies, while the Italians and the French race past us into the fast track, there's now a realization of how much we lost with Brexit, but many of us were warning that before it happened.
You're a writer with extraordinary variety, but also depth, and you present the topics that you choose to write on with a lot of, it's very engaging. Obviously, your style is exceptional. What is it that inspires you, and why do you write? Why do you feel the need to tell these stories?
Well, very kind and flattering what you said, but I think in reality for the last 20 years I've been writing in a sense very rigidly on one subject, which is the East India Company. I've produced 4 books, The Company Quartet. The Anarchy is volume 1, White Mughals is volume 2, Return of a King is volume 3, and The Last Mughal is volume 4. So I love that I've given the impression of variety, but actually it's a fairly straight train track for the last 20 years at least. But around that I've done other stuff, it's true. What inspires me? Just I follow my interests, and I mean it's a very nice lifestyle being a writer. I mean, on a good day you're sitting at home reading books, following your interests. I mean, I really genuinely can say that if I was to win the lottery tomorrow, or one of my books was to be made into a massive Hollywood blockbuster, I never had to work again, I really don't think I'd change my life. I may buy a nice house in Sri Lanka, but otherwise, try and buy back the Cameron's estate in Dilmah or something. But otherwise, I don't think I'd change my lifestyle at all. I literally do what I would do if I didn't have to work.
Well, I hope the Anarchy will be made into a movie.
Well, we've had we've sold the rights to a Bollywood company, but we recently had, I'm not at liberty to reveal the name, but a very, very famous Hollywood producer who would have been absolutely my first choice to do it, has recently approached them to direct.
Outstanding.
So we'll see whether that happens.
Now, my final question. You live in India, so do you take your tea straight? You said no milk and sugar, but do you take chai occasionally?
So to me, they're two completely different drinks. Chai, I love, and we've recently been through a particularly miserable period of weather in Delhi. It's been cold and grey, and Samadraki chai is the best pick-me-up. Particularly, I find in sort of afternoon when you're flagging a bit after a siesta, or not a siesta. Haven't had a siesta. You're flagging a bit anyway. Hot with ginger, very sweet. But that is chai. For me, tea. I like. I'm not going to say the right thing, I'm afraid. My preferred tea, I like a China tea. I like...
as long as it's good tea.
I like a lapsang souchong, or if I'm in a real treat, a dragon's well, or some delicious oolong, or... I quite also like, I've recently developed a taste for that smoky Japanese tea with the little rice.
Genmai cha.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful tea.
And that is lovely tea. And that, I found a little shop in Oxford near the library where I work, which provides really good Japanese tea. So that's rather what I'm drinking at the moment. But yes, without sugar, without milk, and at tea time.
You must try a chai with Ceylon cinnamon. Now you've got some.
I'm looking forward to that, yes.
And the turmeric tea. That's also one that I think you like. Now,
how does that work? Turmeric? In a chai or
well, we've combined it with coconut, vanilla, and Dilmah, well, Dilmah, Ceylon tea, which you know well. So it's a beauty, but you must taste it to understand.
You must, and get me some Dilmah tea, because I feel I should definitely be drinking the family tea plantation.
Yeah, the library tomorrow, so I'll be bringing that across.
I would love that.
But
please.
I observed that you were educated at Ampleforth. I was educated at Stonyhurst, so we start off on a bad footing, but I think we are friends.
I've often gone to Stonyhurst with all those bizarre Catholic relics and
yes,
handkerchiefs dipped in blood and weird Stuart stoles from the old Pretender or Mary Queen of Scots or something.
It's exactly the same even today. But it is a beautiful place. Once, I mean, I had 10 years there. And it's extraordinary.
How did you have 10 years?
Well, all the way from Prep, St. Mary's Hall. But it holds the record, the world record, for the most number of rain days, consecutive rain days, which is 38 or 39, something bizarre. But I mean, that was the reality of Stonyhurst.
But Stonyhurst was never very good at rugby. We always beat Stonyhurst at rugby.
I'm not going to say, well, you're right. I remember the Sevens matches. I've been to a few. I wasn't fortunate enough to play in the Sevens team, but a few of my friends were very upset.
I had a brother who was a very good back and used to be able to kick the ball halfway up the pitch.
Ampleforth was exceptional at that time, particularly in the Sevens, and the Centre Sevens.
I remember when I first arrived there, aged 8, there was a family called the Brodies, who were tea planters that was then Ceylon. And they got, I think the estates were nationalised or something in 72, and that was the year I went to school. So that year they lost control, and the kids moved back, I think, to England. They stayed at Ampleforth, but they lost their old life.
That was a tragedy. You know, this Marxist, it was a Trotskyite kind of a, they called it a revolution, social revolution. It was anything but, because that signaled the demise of the tea industry to a significant extent, and it's now, we're still struggling with the aftermath of that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that history. Interesting. Yeah.
But I hope you'll return.
Thank you. No, I'm looking.
It's been wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And
Great.
And once again, a cheers.
Cheers.
With,
No, I'm enjoying this drink.
silver tips. This is from
disappointed
Craighead
it isn't
Estate.
alcoholic, but it's still...
it's from Craighead Estate. And the founder of Craighead Estate, now that you mention it, was a Cameron. So I'm going to get the name.
It must be the same family. There was
It was
Julie
in
Margaret,
the 1880s.
Julie Margaret and Charles Hay, who wrote the Law Code.
Right.
And they had two sons who were also in the business, and they stayed on.
So Craighead is within our group, and I just remember the first plant. I always know who the first planter was, and it was a Cameron.
Yeah.
So
my
it must be good tea. And now we can adjourn for a
That's
gin
a
and
very
tonic.
nice. That's a very nice link, isn't it? They're very good. So, particularly good drink this year.
Thank you.